Before we start touching up the Despill, let's rough in the color and the defocus on the background. Oftentimes, especially when you're doing Despill, you really need to get the edges to look the same color as the background behind it. So in this case, our raw background is looking very different from our target grade for the shot. So let's get this working in this color range here, and then we can start working on the foreground color and the spill suppression for the foreground while we touch up some of the last little details. So the node we're going to use for that is ZD Focus. This shot already has, the background plate already has a Z channel in it, and it's currently set up to use the direct mode rather than depth mode or anything like that. It just gets further away. If we color probe it here, you'll see the red channel here. The furthest things in the shot don't even go up to 1. So this is using the most basic sort of math for a defocus or a Z defocus, which is the direct mode. Let's go back to the RGBA. The node should already be set up to use direct mode. If it's not, set it to direct mode. And then you don't even need to use the focus plane in this mode. You just use the size of the defocus. So let me view it here. And the best guide for how much to defocus it, even though there is a suggestion here in the match clip, the best guide really would be to use the plate itself. Now, since we can't tell if this stand is exactly against the green screen, we can't be certain that this radius of this blur or defocus is the right amount, but it's a pretty good clue that it's the right amount. We can also see that Everman's edges aren't even in focus because they're obviously using a fairly shallow depth of field. His ears are in focus just barely, but his shoulders aren't. So maybe if the camera's pointing down ever so slightly at him, or his left shoulder is facing towards us a little bit more, his right shoulder is out of focus and these distant objects are way out of focus. So let's use that as our visual target for how much defocus to put in here. Which I would say is maybe about that much. And I'm going to drop in a grade node above this. And to get the overall basic color, I'm going to use my match clip. Since this has already been established, if this was a professional situation, this might be a shot surrounding this shot, or it might have been notes that the client sent for their preference of the color. So in this case, I'm going to color pick the gain right from this white pad, which should be pretty close. And what that will do is it will multiply the entire shot by that value, or the entire image by that value, and I can bring back up the overall brightness using the multiply slider. So let's split the screen here between the two. And that color is almost exactly right on just by multing it by that color. It seems like the amount of defocus I chose is slightly more than the match clip, but I'm going to go with that just because that was what was in the plate. And the bokeh of the lens is round rather than square using this Z defocus in this mode, and I would prefer to see round bokeh, which is a more ideal. So we'll go with that for the grade for the background. So now we have something that is, oh, and it looks like there's a little bit of haze in this shot as well, or atmosphere. So let's lift the black levels to be about the same as the match clip. Got a little bit of a bluish lift in it. So I'm going to use the lift control here. And we'll color pick from the darkest area for the lift control of this grade node. This looks like the darkest area here. And if we A-B back and forth, you can see pretty much in that same zone. Now we can start adjusting Everman's color against the background and really getting a good sense of what we need to do to get the edges to work and suppress any color problems it has. So let's use our hand-rolled color suppression that we've already worked with, and we'll see how this does for us. This is the expression adjustable limit by red or blue suppression. So that looks pretty good. Let's compare it to what we're getting from IBK. So I'm gonna put IBK on the 2 view and we'll switch back and forth. We're getting very similar suppression. The main difference is that IBK seems to be doing something a little bit more aggressive on the edges. It may be the pre-multiplication out of the node, but perhaps we can mix some of this back in. Oh, and ours may be creating a slightly different effect in the highlights. It's suppressing the highlights a bit, tinting them kind of reddish. Maybe we could be a little more careful about that. We don't want to inadvertently especially tint the highlights, which is a danger with a limit by channel spill suppression or screen suppression. So, oh, and IBK is also creating this suppression here that's overly zealous, kind of killing the screen. So let's mix back. Let's mix the two of these together and see if we get lucky. Now remember that our IBK key RGB is in a pre-multiplied state. So if we're not careful, we're going to mess up our pre-multiplication logic. So I'm going to unpre-multiply here before I mix in my limit by. And to do that, I'm going to use a dissolve. And this will mix all channels by default, but we're really only interested in mixing the RGB. If we view at the dissolve, what we can see is it's not mixing in the alpha at all because I haven't selected that. We'll select Mix RGBA. And unfortunately, if we mix it this way, it will mix out the alpha, which we don't really want. So temporarily here, this is kind of a hack, but we're going to copy the alpha channel into this incoming image. So now when it mixes between the two, it won't mix it out, but it will mix together our hand-rolled suppression. So let's just give all 100% of our hand-rolled suppression a shot. And I'm going to drop down another pre-mult here simply because I don't want to mess up any logic that I may have established downstream. This is usually the easiest way to do things. If you know something's in a pre-multiplied state and then you unpremult it, it's usually a good idea to pre-multiply it again later. So this, unfortunately, is creating a brown edge along his shoulder, but it actually seems to have fixed some of the problems with his hair. Fixed the problem with the sizzling on his cheek. So let's try just mixing some of it out and see if we, again, like I said, maybe we'll get lucky and we can find a place in the middle here that kills both problems with one solution. And I didn't think we'd be that lucky, and we were not. So what we'll need to do is bring more of this fix of this not fully suppressed screen in for the hair. We'll need to bring almost all of it in for the hair and maybe his head. But really, we want only a little bit of it for the shoulder. So here's another opportunity to where we could probably use a merge and a mask. So now, rather than using a dissolve, which will also take a mask but will just be a little less intuitive to use that way, I'm going to use a merge. I'm going to just delete that for now, and I'm going to do a merge copy. So I'll hit M just for merge, and then I will select copy mode. So now what copy is doing is it's copying all the channels from A to B. So this is the same as having that dissolve slider turned up 100%. But now, as my dissolve slider, I'm going to create a roto shape. So this roto shape will control how much of one of these comes through. Now I want to pretty much use, looks to me like mostly his head and a little bit of his side here. I want to bring that limit by RB mix suppression in. So I'm just going to, for now, let's say I'll start with a rectangle shape, and we'll just see what we can get away with. I'm going to bring it in for all this. Add another there. Let's see what happens here. Actually, like the result of the limit by more on his face. Then I'm going to drag this out for all this and bring in, kind of fade it over this whole side here. Now we know we're getting too much there, and we wanted to get rid of it there. We also know we got to get rid of some of the other one. So I'm basically using the roto shapes feather controls to control how much of it I mix in. And this is a somewhat unorthodox technique, but don't argue with results. There's no wrong way in compositing. This might not scale well depending on how many of these shots you had to do, but if they were all this tricky, you would be looking for techniques like this. Now, let's see. There, brought in that detail there. So let's see if Everman stays in this box. Staying in there pretty well. So our suppression, we've effectively mixed in suppression using this roto shape. Can variably use some amount of one type of suppression and some of another, using a roto shape to control. And you notice it's just a static roto shape. I'm basically just using it as a soft mix, splitting in one or the other. Now there's still some problem edges here where the mat is not very solid. So what I'm going to do is fix this dark edge while I also kill all these little sizzly bugs. And we will do that just after we've brought all of our mats together. Here. just cleaning up these keyframes so I don't have any spare keyframes, because I definitely want to be able to tune this thing just how I want it. There we go. So what we're going to do for this edge to fix that, simultaneously kill these little sizzlies and this edge, is blur the alpha channel here and shrink it ever so slightly. So I'm going to drop down a blur. I'm only going to blur the alpha channel, and I'm going to create another roto shape. That only grabs this edge here. So let's test this real quick. Just going to blur it, just to see. Yep, there we go. Just blurring it. Then I'm going to put a color lookup below here. And adjust only the alpha channel. And use this to choke the channel just a little, tighten that, darken the darks more. Because these little speckles are actually in the RGB, we may have to get a little bit more heroic about killing them, and we'll probably have to do that up in our out matte here. So I'm starting to get a little crowded here. Let's make some space. And remember, we already choked in our outside matte that we used to trim things. We could use this same roto shape here to also tighten in our outside matte a little bit more as well. So let's go ahead and drop down another erode. I'm actually going to duplicate the one that I'd already created, and I'm going to connect the mask node to this one, and we'll view up here. And for this one, we want to shrink that edge. Well, not that much, but just enough to essentially cut off the outside. And don't forget, we're only doing it in this area here. See, these are kind of spot fixes, these extreme sorts of spot fixes that become necessary when you want to get perfect, like, feature grade composites. Okay, I'm going to duplicate this shape. Rather than using it twice, I'm going to use its own special shape for the erode here. trim off all of the noise on the plate. There we go. Now it's starting to come together. Still have some dark edges, but we'll worry about these a little bit later once we do our edge blurs and stuff, and after we've done our grade. They may not matter.